In the summer of 541 AD, a grain ship docked at the Egyptian port of Pelusium. No one on shore paid it any attention. Grain ships arrived every week, but hidden in the hold, living in the fur of the rats that lived in the grain, were fleas carrying a bacterium that would kill an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Within a year, the emperor of the most powerful civilization on Earth would be lying in bed, his lymph nodes swollen to the size of eggs, his doctors unable to do anything but wait. That bacterium has since been genetically sequenced from the teeth of its victims. It has been identified, classified, and mapped on a phylogenetic tree. And the strain that caused it, the specific genetic variant that demonstrated it could kill tens of millions across 2 centuries of recurring waves, no longer exists. It went extinct. The species survived. The variant vanished. And 600 years later, the same species produced the Black Death. Nobody has explained why. That is one of 10 stories you are about to hear. 10 ancient plagues. Some have been identified, some remain biological ghosts. One may have determined which religion over 1 billion people follow today. And in every single case, the civilizations that endured them reached the same conclusion. This was not natural. This was divine. The Cocoliztli epidemic is where we begin, because it is the one that should disturb you the most. Not because of the death toll, although the death toll is staggering, but because modern medicine identified the pathogen, and the pathogen does not match the symptoms. The Spanish had already conquered Mexico. The temples were rubble. The emperor was dead. Survivors had been relocated into dense agricultural settlements and put to work. And then in the summer of 1545, something arrived that even the conquerors could not name. Franciscan friar Juan de Torquemada recorded what he saw: great fever, black tongue, dark urine, bleeding from the eyes, nose, and mouth, neurological convulsions, death within 3 to 4 days. The Nahuatl word for it was Cocoliztli, which simply means pestilence. They had no specific name for it because nothing like it had ever existed in their world. In 2018, a team at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, led by geneticist Johannes Krauss, extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of victims buried in a mass grave at Tepozcolula Yucunda in Oaxaca. The results, published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, identified Salmonella enterica serovar paratyphi C, a bacterium that causes enteric fever, a pathogen that modern medicine treats with a standard course of antibiotics. That bacterium killed an estimated 5 to 15 million people in 3 years. Spanish colonial census records document a population of approximately 25 million indigenous Mexicans in 1518. By 1600, that number had fallen to approximately 1 million, a collapse of 96% in 80 years, with the Cocoliztli identified as the sharpest single phase of that decline. Tree ring data confirmed the drought of the 1540s as the worst in 500 years in the region. The surviving population was already malnourished, already immunologically shattered by decades of smallpox and measles, already broken by the physical and psychological violence of conquest. And into that vulnerability, Salmonella paratyphi C arrived. But here is the detail that keeps this case open. Enteric fever, even in its most severe untreated presentations, does not produce hemorrhagic bleeding from the eyes and nose. Francisco Hernandez, the royal physician of Philip II of Spain, was not writing poetry, he was writing a clinical report. He documented hemorrhage. And Salmonella paratyphi C does not cause hemorrhage. Some researchers have proposed a viral co-infection, something resembling a hantavirus or an ancestral filovirus emerging from rodent reservoirs driven into human settlements by the drought. If that is the case, the true killer left no recoverable genetic material after 5 centuries of soil exposure. The salmonella may have been a co-pathogen, not the primary cause. And if the hemorrhagic agent emerged from a rodent reservoir, that reservoir still exists somewhere in central Mexico. We found the teeth, we extracted the DNA, we identified a bacterium, but the bleeding in the friar's reports has never been explained. And that is the detail that will not go away. From a killer that left bones and unanswered questions in the soil of Mexico, we cross the Atlantic to a city that had a trained observer, a mass burial pit discovered 2,400 years later, and a mystery that modern medicine has proposed at least a dozen solutions for and solved none of them. Athens in 430 BC was the most powerful democracy on Earth. It had defeated the Persian Empire at Marathon. It had built the Parthenon. Its navy controlled the Aegean. Then a ship docked at the port of Piraeus, and within 2 years, the architect of Athenian democracy was dead, and a quarter of the population was in mass graves. Thucydides survived the plague and described it in his History of the Peloponnesian War with the clinical detachment of a man performing an autopsy on his own civilization. He listed symptoms in order of progression: violent heat in the head, redness and inflammation of the eyes, bleeding from the throat and tongue, sneezing, hoarseness, chest pain, vomiting, a pustular rash covering the body, and an overwhelming internal burning so severe that victims threw themselves into wells seeking water. Approximately 100,000 Athenians died in 4 years. Pericles died in 429 BC. In 1994, during construction of the Athens Metro in the Keremikos district, workers uncovered a mass burial pit containing nearly 150 bodies, consistent with emergency epidemic disposal. In 2006, a team led by Manolis Papagrigorakis at the University of Athens extracted DNA from the dental pulp of the Keremikos victims and published findings in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases proposing typhoid fever as the cause. At least a dozen pathogens have been proposed with serious academic support: typhoid, typhus, smallpox, measles, Ebola, toxic shock syndrome, and various combinations. Every candidate fits some of the symptoms and fails on others. And then there's the detail that stops every proposed diagnosis. Thucydides recorded that birds and scavenging animals that fed on the corpses also died. Typhoid fever does not kill birds. Thucydides was not a poet improvising metaphors. His account is the most deliberately precise medical document of the ancient world. That single observation about animal mortality either describes a real biological phenomenon that no proposed pathogen can account for, or Thucydides inserted an unexplained anomaly into the most careful clinical record of antiquity for no reason anyone has ever been able to provide. Could this be a disease that no longer exists? A pathogen that burned itself out in the catastrophe it caused? Science has supposedly answered this question, but the answer keeps changing, and the birds keep dying in the text, unexplained after 2.5 millennia. The Roman legions marched home from the Parthian War as conquerors. They had sacked Seleucia on the Tigris, looted its temples, and driven its people into the desert. They came home carrying something they could not see. Within 3 years, it was killing 2,000 people a day in Rome. Galen of Pergamon witnessed the epidemic firsthand and documented the symptoms: full-body pustular rash, black diarrhea indicating internal hemorrhage, throat inflammation, sustained high fever. A clinical picture that modern epidemiologists recognize as most consistent with smallpox. But if this was smallpox in 165 AD, no earlier Roman source describes this disease anywhere in the Mediterranean world. Something entirely new crossed that eastern frontier. The epidemic killed an estimated 5 million people, including Emperor Lucius Verus in 169 AD. Kyle Harper's 2017 analysis in The Fate of Rome showed that some provinces lost up to a third of their population. The legions suffered such catastrophic manpower losses that Marcus Aurelius recruited gladiators and Germanic tribesmen to maintain frontier defense. Silver content in Roman coins dropped from 90% to 75%, the earliest measurable phase of monetary debasement. And Chinese historical sources record a nearly identical epidemic striking the Han Dynasty in the same years, 161 and 162 AD. Two physicians writing in different languages on opposite sides of the known world, Galen in Rome and Zhang Zhang in China, appear to have been documenting the same disease. Zhang Zhang wrote that his own clan of 200 people lost 70% of its members in less than 10 years. Han census records show a population collapse from 56 million to 16 million over 3 centuries. The Silk Road that enriched both empires had quietly built a pathogen highway connecting them. Could the fall of Rome and the fragmentation of the Han Dynasty, separated by 6,000 kilometers, be two expressions of the same biological catastrophe? 80 years later, something worse arrived. The bishop of Carthage watched his congregation die and sat down to write not a lament, but a theological argument. The plague, Cyprian wrote, was a gift. It separated the faithful from the fearful. His sermon De Mortalate, written around 252 AD, contains the most detailed symptom description from any contemporary source. Profuse diarrhea, projectile vomiting, hemorrhage from the eyes, gangrene consuming the extremities of living patients, hands and feet falling away while the patient still breathed. 5,000 deaths per day in Rome alone at its peak. The epidemic lasted 13 years, from 249 to 262 AD. In Luxor, at the site of ancient Thebes, the Italian archaeological mission, led by Francesco Tiradriti, discovered bodies covered in thick layers of lime, 3 kilns for producing lime, and a giant bonfire of human remains. The first physical archaeological evidence of organized response to this epidemic. Egyptian papyri record entire villages appearing as completely depopulated on tax rolls. Emperor Justinian died in 251 AD. Kyle Harper argues the plague may have caused the political fragmentation of the crisis of the 3rd century rather than coinciding with it. Most historians classify it as likely a filovirus, possibly an ancestral relative of Ebola. But Ebola burns fast. The 2014 to 2016 West African epidemic killed approximately 11,000 people across 18 months before exhausting its susceptible population. The Plague of Cyprian killed 5,000 per day in a single city and traveled across the Mediterranean for 13 years without burning out. Whatever it was, it did not behave like anything we have a classification for. 3 centuries later, the Mediterranean faced its first confirmed bubonic plague pandemic, and this time we have the DNA. Justinian had a dream of reassembling the Roman Empire. His generals had reconquered North Africa and Italy. Constantinople was the greatest city on earth. Then, grain ships arrived from Egypt. Procopius of Caesarea witnessed what followed. 10,000 deaths per day, bodies stacked in towers along the city walls, loaded onto ships and dumped at sea, crammed into buildings that were bricked shut, ships drifting with no living crew. Justinian himself contracted the plague in 542 AD and survived. His empire did not. In 2013, David Wagner's team confirmed Yersinia pestis through ancient DNA from 6th century remains at Oschheim in Bavaria. In 2019, Marcel Keller and colleagues recovered ancient DNA from 17 victims across 5 European countries and confirmed a single genetic lineage, one the study explicitly identifies as subsequently extinct. Yersinia pestis did not go extinct. It returned in 1347 as the Black Death. The species survived, only this variant vanished. Some researchers propose the surviving population acquired sufficient immune memory to interrupt transmission, and the 600-year gap represents the generational span required for that memory to fade. Immune memory does not pass to descendants. Could the rhythm of plague pandemics reflect not the pathogen's evolution, but the human immune system's forgetting cycle? Within 50 years, around 1200 BC, every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean ceased to exist. The Mycenaeans, who built walls from stones so massive that later Greeks believed giants had placed them. The Hittite Empire, that fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh. The city of Ugarit, the greatest trading port of the ancient world, burned and never rebuilt. Someone pressed a clay tablet in the city's final hours. It describes a great death. It describes cities being consumed. The tablet was never delivered. Eric Klein's 2014 synthesis, 1177 BC, laid out the multi-causal model: drought, invasion, agricultural failure, the mysterious sea peoples. But something still does not add up about the speed. Drought is slow. Invasions are regional. The Mycenaean, Hittite, Ugaritic, and Levantine civilizations all failed within a single human lifetime. Brandon Drake's 2012 study in the Journal of Archaeological Science confirmed a severe multi-decade drought beginning around 1200 BC, using pollen cores from the Sea of Galilee. Skeletal analysis of Bronze Age collapse populations by Israel Hershkovitz and colleagues shows stress markers consistent with malnutrition and infectious disease. Hittite king Mursili II left prayer texts describing a plague that killed his father Suppiluliuma I, explicitly stating the disease arrived with Egyptian prisoners of war. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was abandoned without evidence of conquest. No mass battle casualties, no extensive burning, no final defensive stand. The population ceased to exist rather than being defeated. Linear B tablets from Mycenaean sites record increasingly desperate ration distributions and emergency military mobilizations. The administrative record of a civilization trying and failing to manage simultaneous crises. Disease may not have caused the Bronze Age collapse, but it may have been the accelerant that turned manageable stress into total civilizational extinction. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was the most densely interconnected trade network in world history up to that point. Could the very infrastructure that made these civilizations great, the grain ships, the diplomatic missions, the prisoner exchanges, have been the precise mechanism through which a pathogen traveled fast enough to outrun every civilization's capacity to respond? From the Mediterranean at the edge of recorded history, we cross to a city most people have never heard of, a city larger than medieval London that disappeared without leaving a single written word. At its peak around 1100 AD, Cahokia held 20,000 people. Monk's Mound, its central earthwork, contains more earth than any structure built in North America for centuries. Its trade network stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Then, sometime after 1150, it began to die. By 1400, it was empty. No European had arrived, no foreign army attacked. In 2015, A.J. White's study in American Antiquity analyzed sediment cores from Horseshoe Lake and identified a catastrophic flood deposit around 1150 A.D. consistent with Mississippi River flooding that contaminated the city's fresh water supply. Jerome Rose at the University of Arkansas found elevated rates of enamel hypoplasia in post-1150 skeletons, markers of infectious disease and nutritional stress. Isotopic analyses showed the population drew heavily from distant regions, meaning no stable local immune population existed. The flood created precise conditions for a waterborne epidemic to move through the city with catastrophic speed. Unlike every other major collapse site, Cahokia left no written records, no oral tradition, no external observer. The silence at the bottom of Horseshoe Lake has not yet been made to speak. From a city that left no written record of its end, we cross to one whose written records were deliberately destroyed. Akhenaten built the most radical city in Egyptian history. He abolished every god in the Egyptian pantheon, declared the sun disk the only true deity, moved the entire capital to a blank stretch of desert, and forced a civilization 3,000 years old to follow him into the experiment. Within a generation, his city was dead. His name was chiseled from every monument. His successors acted as if he had never existed. The Amarna project, led by archaeologist Barry Kemp of Cambridge University since 1977, analyzed the South Tombs Cemetery, a workers' graveyard containing over 3,000 individuals. Approximately 70% showed evidence of significant physical stress and infectious disease, a rate far exceeding comparable Egyptian cemeteries from other sites and periods. In 2010, a joint study by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities and the University of Freiburg identified DNA of Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal malaria strain, in multiple members of the royal family. Tutankhamun himself died at approximately 18, with skeletal evidence of multiple concurrent serious infections. And then there is the evidence from outside Egypt. Hittite royal archives at Hattusa contain explicit records of an epidemic arriving from Egypt during the Amarna period, carried by Egyptian envoys, that killed King Suppiluliuma I and his crown prince. The Hittite records name Akhenaten's court as the source. If Amarna was exporting plague to foreign courts through diplomatic contact, the conditions inside the city must have been catastrophic. The royal family was dying. The workers were dying at rates that exceed comparable populations. The epidemic was traveling outward along Egypt's diplomatic networks to kill foreign kings. This is not a coincidence that happens to overlap with a political explanation. This is a disease with an address. Akhenaten chose Amarna's location based on a religious vision, selecting a stretch of the Nile bank specifically avoided by previous Egyptian settlement. Could one pharaoh's theology have accidentally placed his city in a zone of exceptional mosquito density and plasmodium exposure that established sites had learned through centuries of accumulated experience to leave uninhabited? In the year 627 AD, the Sassanid Persian Empire was the most powerful state on earth. It had just defeated Byzantium, occupied Jerusalem, captured the True Cross, and extended its borders to the gates of Constantinople. Its armies had not lost a major campaign in a generation. Then an epidemic arrived in the royal capital of Ctesiphon. Within months, the emperor was dead. His successor was dead. The royal court had been effectively annihilated. 9 years later, Arab armies swept through what remained. The Plague of Sheroe, named after the birth name of King Kavad II, is documented in the Arabic Chronicle of Sirte, the Syriac Chronicles, and by the Byzantine historian Theophanes, who recorded the Persian court's sudden collapse. Persian primary sources are sparse because the Sassanid literary tradition was largely destroyed during the Arab conquests that followed. Kavad II seized the throne by overthrowing his father Khosrow I in early 628 and executing all his brothers, eliminating every alternative heir. Then the plague killed him within months of taking power. What followed was 8 different rulers in 4 years. Not a political crisis, a biological decapitation of an entire civilization's leadership class. According to the 10th century historian al-Masudi, at least a third of Iran's population died. Al-Tabari reported that most of the Persians perished. Contemporary Syriac Christian sources describe mass burials across Mesopotamia, with entire villages depopulated. The timing placed the epidemic in a population whose immune resilience had already been catastrophically compromised by 26 years of continuous warfare against Byzantium. Military exhaustion does not produce 8 rulers in 4 years. Financial stress does not kill the emperor, his heir, and the assembled military command simultaneously. The Chronicle of Sirte does not describe a dynasty that wore itself out. It describes a ruling class that was medically annihilated in a single epidemic season. If the Sassanid leadership had not been wiped out in 628, would the Arab armies arriving in 636 have encountered organized imperial resistance? Would Islam have remained a regional Arabian movement rather than expanding across Persia, Central Asia, and South Asia? Could the linguistic, religious, and political geography of the modern Middle East trace its deepest origin not to a military conquest or a theological revolution, but to an unidentified pathogen that arrived in Ctesiphon in the autumn of 627? 10 civilizations, 10 epidemics, some named, some still unidentified, one that went extinct and came back 600 years later as something worse, one that may have redirected the religious trajectory of over 1 billion living people, and the same pattern in every single case. The epidemic does not arrive in an empty landscape. It arrives at the moment of maximum civilizational complexity. It arrives when the trade routes are fullest, when the grain ships are most active, when the diplomatic missions are traveling most frequently between courts. The Silk Road that made Rome and the Han dynasty wealthy built the transmission corridor that killed them both. The grain ships that fed Constantinople fed the rats that carried the fleas that carried the plague. The Bronze Age's most sophisticated diplomatic network was also the network along which a great death traveled from Egypt to Hattusa in a single generation. The very infrastructure that made these societies great was the mechanism through which the pathogen moved. Historians will tell you these collapses were inevitable, that civilizations become complex and complexity becomes fragility and fragility becomes collapse. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the bones in those burial pits were not the bones of an inevitable historical process. They were the bones of specific people who felt a specific fever on a specific morning and did not survive the week. Pericles had a headache. Kavad II had a fever. The workers at Amarna had swollen lymph nodes, and nobody knew what it meant. The Ugarit messenger pressed a clay tablet with a message about a great death and sent it down a road that no longer existed by the time it arrived. In the summer of 1545 in central Mexico, someone felt a burning behind the eyes. No one wrote down their name. No one recorded the moment their world ended. 5 centuries later, we found their teeth in the ground. The DNA was still there. The dead do not disappear, and the questions they left behind are not ancient questions, they are current ones. The rodent reservoirs still exist, the trade routes are faster now, the grain ships are bigger, and somewhere, in some animal population we have not yet surveilled, something is waiting for the conditions that allow it to cross over. The ancients called it divine punishment because they had no other framework. We have microscopes and gene sequencers and phylogenetic trees, but we still cannot explain the bleeding in the friars' reports, the dying birds in Thucydides, or the 600-year silence between the first and second plague pandemics. The gods may have left the conversation, but the questions they were supposedly answering have not.